was, what's the worst case for nuclear? What's the most expensive nuclear plant you can think of? And so we chose the EPR that's being built in Finland right now because everyone brings it up. It's way over, it's 3 times over budget. It's taken over 10 years to build. Who knows when it's going to get done? It's a disaster. We can't, that's not an option for the future. It's too expensive. So we compared that with the best case for solar, which we chose as Germany, because they do have the most solar power, just in absolute terms. And they have a huge set of policies to promote solar power. So what we looked at was the total lifetime cost of energy from both of those sources. So we took the capital cost, the worst case capital cost, so not just what the EPR is costing now, but like what critics think it's going to escalate to even in more years. So we took that cost, we levelized it over, only 20 years. And we took an 80% capacity factor. We chose kind of a normal number for O&M and fuel costs and things like that. And then for solar, it's hard to get the full system cost, but what we did is we took the feed-in tariff, so what the utility is paying to buy that power from those plants, which if they didn't have that feed-in tariff, they wouldn't be building solar power. We looked at how much it costs for the same amount of energy. And you can see it's a big difference. It's about a factor of 4 different. And this was really surprising to a lot of people because everyone brings up Germany as the best case. They have this renewables revolution. It's cheaper than coal. That's not true, but people say it. So we wanted to compare it for this. Everyone brings up Finland as, well, nuclear's doomed because of Finland. So that was a big surprise to us that it was still so much cheaper, and that's because, as you know, nuclear just provides so much energy. But it is still a big challenge of convincing utilities to front that cost. But if you have a government that's concerned about providing cheap energy because they have industry that they want to keep, or they have people that buy energy like you and me that they want to keep happy, something to keep in mind. So another one, I mentioned I was involved in the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project. When I went there, I found them very mild on nuclear, very positive about renewables. And so when the final report came out, I was very surprised that they had this graph. So this is globally, how much does it cost to reach a 2-degree target or a 450 target? Whoops, I don't want it. Hold on. Okay. And they had four general scenarios. This report has a lot of different scenarios by country, but they combined them all together, and they found that the high nuclear scenario was actually the cheapest. And this is for, and it's about a third cheaper than their high renewable scenario. And what's interesting is the high nuclear scenario obviously still has a lot of renewables in it because it's trying to get to 80% clean energy globally. So obviously you're going to need a mix, and that's great. But it was the cheapest, so I was really surprised to see that. And this is what's supposed to be educating the negotiation process at COP21 in Paris. So they actually didn't get a lot of press when this report came out. Maybe this is one of the reasons. Maybe it's because they didn't include Africa. But yeah, so that was surprising. So when you look at, in terms of making a transition for the whole world to really high penetration of clean energy, nuclear is still your best choice. And I think that's something that people need to sort of get more courage to talk about. So, all the reasons I've talked about so far, all of these arguments, which I hope you share and use, they really are based on histories from the West. So, mostly from the US and Europe, which is a lot of what we talk about when we're looking at, you know, what's worked, what hasn't worked in nuclear. But I'm sure most of you know that's not where nuclear is being built today. So there's very different arguments that you want to look at. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about what we kind of call emerging nuclear economies. And there's countries that are building nuclear now. About half the plants under construction now are in China. There's also a lot in Russia, former Soviet Union countries, South Korea. There's technically 2 under construction in Japan. I don't know where is it going. 6 in India, 2 in Pakistan. There's also plants under construction in Brazil, Argentina, and United Arab Emirates. UAE is not a developing country, but they are building their first nuclear power plants. There's also 40 additional countries that are in negotiations to get their first nuclear power plant. And a lot of those are in places where we don't really think about having nuclear power, like sub-Saharan Africa, Colombia, Peru, Vietnam, Jordan, a lot of Middle Eastern countries. So now I think it's really important to ask, why are these countries pursuing nuclear power? Is it the same reasons that we were 30 years ago? Is it different reasons? Because now nuclear seems sort of frowned upon in the West. So one of the big ones is rising electricity consumption. A lot of developing countries and a lot of middle-income countries in Asia have double-digit growth in energy consumption every year. And as they industrialize, this is a big issue. And as we know, this was a similar case in Europe and the US in the 70s. How do you meet that high growth of energy? This is kind of unusual, and this was true in a lot of the West as well. So if you don't have a domestic source of fossil fuels, it's very expensive to import them. And this was one of the reasons France pursued nuclear in the 1970s. They didn't have coal. They didn't want to keep importing gas. And it's also the case in Japan today. In a lot of islands, like the UK, Japan, you don't want to import all your fossil fuels. So you want something that's very dense that you can have inventory. But besides those places, even in China, who has lots of coal, getting the coal from the mountains where it is to the cities where it's needed is a huge effort, and it's stressing the rail capacity. They have to build more tracks and build more trains just to move that coal around. And it takes a very large volume of coal to move through. I remember I did my graduate studies in Colorado, and there's a huge coal plant right outside of Denver, and it takes about, I think, 3 train cars an hour of coal. And they only keep about a 2-month supply on site. So if something were to happen to the rail network, we go about 2 months and then that's it. So it's just a reliability issue and a security issue. Another big one that people don't think about when you're thinking about developing countries is urbanization. So urbanization, we all know about it in places like the US and Europe. Everyone's moving towards urban areas, but even in developing countries, there's a strong trend of urbanization. So this is Nairobi, Kenya. A lot of times when we see pictures or we see reports on energy access in sub-Saharan Africa, you see thatched roofs, a little solar panel. But sub-Saharan Africa is increasingly urban, and there's not a lot of roofs to put solar panels on here. So they're going to need dense, reliable energy just like we do. And that's a great reason. And also as countries industrialize, they need that really high sort of quality of energy. So all this kind of leads us up to the energy access issue, which I think gets a lot of attention, especially in the Bay Area. There's a lot of people that are concerned about human development and just bringing people up to modern standards. So for all the talk of energy efficiency, I'm sure that we in the West could use a little less electricity, we could be more efficient. But that sort of ignores this issue of the 1 billion people that currently don't have access to electricity. And they don't need to be more efficient, they need to use a lot more electricity. So it's interesting, I took this graphic, this is just where the energy poor live in the world. It's mostly sub-Saharan Africa, but I took this report from a blog post at the World Coal Association. So they obviously recognize the importance of this market for bringing electricity to people. So something that I was really surprised about, I said I've been looking at global decarbonization scenarios. So I've looked at a lot of the big environmental organizations, but also international organizations like the IEA has their World Energy Outlook. Environmental organizations like Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, Sierra Club, they have these, scenarios to 2050, how do we mitigate climate change? They all have these people staying without access. It's really good for climate change if you don't let these people have any energy. So a lot of those scenarios will have global energy consumption going down in absolute terms. So obviously the US could go down. There's a lot of places, vehicles could be more efficient, homes could be more efficient. But in absolute terms, most of the population growth is in these countries, most of the economic growth is in these countries. They're going to use so much more energy than we can even think about. And just pretending that they're going to stop at a light bulb and a cell phone is sort of offensive if you care about sort of raising the standard of living. So keep that in mind, 1 billion people without access to electricity. Okay, so what are the solutions? And this is sort of part of the bigger debate. So one popular solution is sort of distributed energy, and that's extremely popular here in Berkeley and in venture capital firms and startups in San Francisco. Is you get your NGO to provide solar panels to people, which is great. They can power a light bulb at night so they can study. They can charge their cell phone. There's also a lot of clean cook stove efforts, solar cook stoves. You can heat some beans. And this does something. But if you're of the more cynical mind, you'll note that this doesn't really put people on a path to development. You're not going to be increasing people's incomes with the solar panel. You're not going to be getting them into industries where they can get a salary. And critics, the strongest critics of this vision say that you're simply shining a light on their poverty. But this is where most of the focus is in the energy access conversation. So there's another solution, and this is what we talk about a lot, and we try to find thinkers who are looking at this issue. Catherine Wolfram, who's here at Berkeley in the Economies department, has written about this, that a lot of people that we think of as being off-grid are actually what she calls under-grid. So they live by a grid, but they can't afford to buy power from it. So it's not that we need to give them distributed energy because they can't reach the actual electricity, it's that they're too poor to buy it, and giving them a solar panel doesn't help. So the better option is to kind of realize what's happened in other countries to bring universal electricity access. So not just the West, there's good case studies on how the US brought electricity to rural areas or how European countries did it, but there's also really good case studies on how more recent countries were able to do universal electricity access. So a place like Mexico, the Philippines, Thailand, Brazil, countries that are still pretty poor, but have managed to bring electricity to everyone. And what you can learn from those countries is that kind of the fastest and most efficient way to bring electricity to people is to first have a company build a power plant to power a factory. And what that does is it employs people to work in that factory. And they get more income, and they are able to afford to connect their home to the grid. Maybe the grid was already there, or maybe it was brought there for that factory. But it's really that economic access to electricity that's important, and what's missing in that other model. And once you have that factory, you bring the grid out, then more people can buy electricity, and then you can start powering things like hospitals and schools, because the more people you have on the grid, it brings the price down for everyone. So this method works better because it's part of a large government effort to do development. It's not an outside organization that comes in and builds this one solar panel. When you expand the grid, you also have to build roads, you also have to set up something that we don't think about as being that important, but the billing system sort of gets people into the system and into expecting things from government. So if you're living off-grid with a solar panel, you may not even think that you have a representative politician to talk to, but if now you're paying a bill, you know, there's a rural electrification board that has meetings and you can go and complain to them, and sort of gets people into not just electricity access, but access to democracy, access to government, and kind of gets them on the pathway to having full modern lives. So that's sort of our vision what we're working on, and we published some of this in a report that came out last year called High Energy Planet. I think I already said this. Just important to remember that energy is not just something we use for silly things like washing machines, which are not silly, they're very important. But energy drives economic growth, and cheap, reliable baseload power allows countries to industrialize. And industrialization has a bad connotation because we associate it with pollution, but we don't have to. It's also associated with modernity and living these great modern lives we have, and with our high quality of life. So if you have scalable, low carbon energy that allows countries to decarbonize as they modernize, which is really the best path that you want. Okay. So all of this means that there is a huge market for energy, but also for nuclear power. And other countries realize this. So South Korea is building 5.6 gigawatts in the United Arab Emirates, as I mentioned. South Korea built a lot of their nuclear power because they saw this market potential and they wanted to export the technology. Russia is right now the largest builder of nuclear reactors in terms of number of reactors that are being built. Rosatom, and they want to build in Turkey, and South Africa, and Vietnam, and Jordan. And China is trying to follow a similar path to South Korea. They want to start exporting. They're building their first ones. They already built 2.2 gigawatts in Pakistan. But they're also looking to build in South Africa or other Asian countries like Vietnam. So, big market. So we wrote a report about this issue a little bit, which is called High Energy Innovation. And the questions we were trying to ask, which I've asked some of them here, are where is the demand for energy growing the fastest? And where do we think innovation in energy I don't know what it means. The in demand was the question I was asking there. So the result we found, which should be obvious, is that energy innovation is going to happen where energy demand is really high. Because in the West, we got our grid, it works pretty well, we have our energy supply, the lights stay on, we can do incremental innovation, but there's not a huge unmet demand that's there. So the main thing that we argue, or that we conclude in this report, is that there's a really strong economic and geopolitical incentive for the US to stay in the nuclear power industry. We need to replace plants in the US that are going to retire. We'd love to build new plants to reduce pollution and carbon emissions. But there's also just a reason for the US from an international relations perspective to stay in the game. However, there's low demand for nuclear here because electricity demand isn't growing that strong. And there's really high demand in other countries. So our recommendation is that there used to be a big focus on competition, so the US nuclear industry against the French nuclear industry competing for contracts, or we need to be building plants in China. So we're suggesting that the move goes towards collaboration. So you have the people with the expertise, like the US, collaborating with the countries where demand is really high, like China. So we did a bunch of case studies in the report about nuclear power, but I just thought I would show our map, which kind of concludes that there is a lot of great collaboration going on between countries. If you can't read this, go get the report from our website, it's free. But you have, the US is collaborating with China on molten salt, they're collaborating with South Korea on pyroprocessing. There's a lot of great collaboration going on in terms of building plants or doing R&D. ITER is a great example of 30 countries working together. Maybe that's not the technology you want, but you know, maybe it's a good model for doing R&D. So there's a lot of great examples here. The report also has case studies on carbon capture and sequestration, shale gas and solar power, looking at international collaboration on innovation. So that is sort of where we ended up. So that's a really kind of quick summary of the work we've done in the past, particularly in nuclear work. Just to give you a little bit on what I'm doing now. We have a long ongoing project on nuclear economics. I mentioned the report, How to Make Nuclear Cheap. Now we're sort of doing what should have been the prequel of why is nuclear expensive and how can we make it cheaper through even more drastic means, and really understanding what goes into the cost of nuclear power in different countries and how it could be brought down. I'm working on this more academic exercise of doing an evolutionary tree of reactor models. There's many questions we can answer with that, but right now we're just making it to understand. A lot of what we do, or what I do now, is still looking into policies to accelerate advanced reactor development, particularly Gen 4. And that kind of covers everything. I look at other industries like aviation or commercial spaceflight and see what they've done. And there's a lot of different venues we could take. And then, as I mentioned, we're doing a big meta-analysis on the land use intensity of energy. And that's more aimed at convincing traditional environmental organizations that they need to start thinking about land use when they're making recommendations on energy policy. So that's it. Thank you. I can stick around and answer questions. Also, I'm local. I'm in Oakland. I recommend you go to our website, thebreakthrough.org, if you want to see all the work we do across our different programs. If you have any questions, you can also email me. It's just Jessica@thebreakthrough. And if you want to keep up to date on what we're doing on nuclear, follow me on Twitter. It's also where I have all my arguments. So I welcome arguments. Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah. Have you considered the type of electricity markets where nuclear gets built? So let's say the regulated markets is very hard because private industry doesn't have the long time span for capital recovery, whereas wherever it's regulated, they're guaranteed their income.
Yeah, so we've definitely found that trend as well, whether it's in the U.S., states that are still regulated are the ones building nuclear, and countries that have regulated markets are still the ones building nuclear. But there's a lot of countries that need nuclear or need more nuclear that are liberalized or unregulated or deregulated, I guess. So some of what we look at is how do you build nuclear in those markets, and it's not just nuclear, it's hard to build anything in those markets. So it's kind of a question of what types of, that's more traditional policy support, like loan guarantees might be good, or like a low carbon portfolio standard rather than a renewable portfolio standard. But the big one is bringing the capital costs down to a point where it's easier for utilities to build it. And also just bringing the size down, because that's sort of where SMRs are more of an innovation for that problem, where maybe a utility can't afford a 1 gigawatt plant, but they can afford, a 200 megawatt plant right now. And also where you have low growth in electricity, you want to add on those smaller chunks. And it's a lot more manageable for your grid. So I think SMRs are a good innovation, a good business innovation for for that product.
SMR, small modular.
Yes, small modular.
One more. Yes, Matt.
You presented some of the scenarios in which, for example, Russia sells reactor to Turkey or South Korea sells a reactor to UAE. But those countries are relatively rich and they can afford to buy reactors. But other countries that need electricity cannot afford to buy a reactor. So do you think there is a possibility of a market where instead of buying a reactor to the countries, there is a foreign entity that comes in, build a reactor, and sell electricity?
Well,
That's
That's the thing in Turkey.
Yeah.
Turkey is a country for nobody money.
yeah, so I'll answer that. So one of the reasons that Russia,
Speaker will ask the question.
Arjun might even know this answer, but Russia is primarily building in lower income countries, and part of the reason is that they offer financing, which Aruba doesn't do, Westinghouse doesn't do, GE doesn't do. So they're building in countries like South Africa, which is still pretty poor. China's building in Pakistan, and China would really love to build in sub-Saharan Africa. And China has the money to finance these projects. China's actually bought into the Hinkley C EPR build in the UK. And there's now what's called a BRICS bank, so it's sort of a competitor to the World Bank that's looking at doing infrastructure projects in Africa. So that's another mechanism where maybe that financing might come from a third party.
One last question.
Yeah, really quick. You said some of your reports were focusing on policy, on how to promote nuclear in a lot of these countries. Did any of those touch on the issue of nuclear waste, which is one of the big, obstacles in terms of policy for the implementation of nuclear?
We haven't, and we particularly in How to Make Nuclear Cheap say that waste is not a big driver of the cost. So we didn't cover it in that report. We're working on a report right now with an organization called Third Way, the Clean Air Task Force, on addressing nuclear waste. But nuclear waste is this issue where it has to be solved either way, and it's more it's different policies. And we do have countries that are doing it successfully, like Sweden and Finland. Maybe we can follow their example, but we haven't written anything specifically talking about waste.
Cool.
And
Thank
maybe
you.
we should.
Let's thank the speaker.